The dust motes danced in the slanted rays of the late afternoon sun, the only things moving with any grace in the oppressive heat of the high desert. Jack squinted against the glare, his hand a visor over his brow. His world had shrunk to the cracked earth beneath his worn boots, the stubborn, thin hide of his cattle, and the ever-present, gnawing worry that was a physical knot in his gut. The letter from the bank, crisp and officious, felt like a brand in his pocket, its words seared into his mind. Foreclosure, 30 days, final notice. His father's ranch, a patch of scrubland and memories, was slipping through his fingers like the very sand he stood on. He was a man more comfortable with the language of horses and horizons than with people or ledgers. Words failed him in town, where men with soft hands and hard eyes spoke of liens and percentages. But out here, in the vastness of the canyonlands that bordered the territory of the Apache, he could breathe. And it was here, in this contested, rugged space, that a desperate hope had taken root. A whisper, passed from one desperate soul to another in the dim light of the saloon, had spoken of a bounty. A man named Corbin, known by the ugly moniker Coyote, was hiding out in the Red Rock labyrinths. A killer, a rustler, a man whose head was worth $500. A sum that could pull the bank's teeth, at least for a season. For 3 days, Jack had tracked. He followed the faintest of signs, a dislodged stone here, a snapped twig there, the cold ashes of a hidden fire. His own horse, a loyal dun named Pike, seemed to sense his master's tension, its ears flicking constantly, its steps cautious. They moved through a cathedral of stone, through canyons that echoed with the ghosts of wind and older, more ancient things. Jack's rifle, a heavy Winchester, lay across his saddle, a cold and familiar weight. He tried not to think about what capturing a man like Coyote would entail, about the violence that might be necessary. He focused on the number, the magical, life-saving number, 500. On the 4th morning, he found it. A thread, a literal thread of dark wool, snagged on a catclaw bush near a thin trickle of a stream that carved its way through the canyon floor. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. The trail was fresh. He led Pike by the reins now, moving on foot, his every sense screamingly alert. The canyon walls narrowed, the air growing cooler in the shade. The only sounds were the scuff of his boots, the soft snort of his horse, and the persistent, gentle murmur of the water. And then he saw the figure, 100 yards ahead, kneeling by the stream, its back to him. A shape shrouded in a heavy, dun-colored blanket with a hood pulled up, obscuring any features. A rifle was leaned against a rock within easy reach. The figure was still, seemingly intent on the water, perhaps drinking or filling a container. Everything aligned with the description. A man hiding his face, armed, isolated in Coyote's known territory. The thread, the location, the furtive posture. It was a perfect, terrible equation that added up to his bounty. A cold sweat broke out on Jack's forehead, a mix of fear, adrenaline, and a profound, soul-deep reluctance. He was a rancher, not a lawman. He'd broken mustangs and mended fences, not men. But the image of the bank notice floated before his eyes, superimposed over the solitary figure. There was no choice. It was this or ruin. He made his decision in a single, sharp inhalation. Tying Pike's reins to a stunted juniper, he moved forward, using the cover of the large boulders that lined the stream. He was surprisingly quiet, his years of moving through rough country serving him now for a purpose he never imagined. The distance closed. 50 yards. 30. He could see the intricate pattern on the blanket, a geometric design of black and red. He could see the lean, wiry frame beneath it. The figure remained oblivious, a perfect target. His plan was simple, brutal, and born of panic. He would not call out, would not risk a shootout. He would overwhelm, subdue, and bind. He rehearsed the motions in his head, a frantic, silent mantra. Asterisk, rush, tackle, disarm, tie. At 10 yards, he broke into a run. It was not a graceful charge. It was a clumsy, desperate lunge, all flying limbs and raw force. He crashed into the kneeling figure with the full weight of his body. The air left the other's lungs in a sharp, surprised grunt. They tumbled together onto the rocky bank, a tangle of limbs and coarse wool. The figure was stronger than Jack had anticipated, wiry and resilient, fighting back with a frantic, twisting energy. An elbow caught Jack hard in the ribs, and he saw stars, but he held on, his own fear lending him a terrible strength. He managed to pin one arm, then the other, using his knees and weight to immobilize the struggling form. He fumbled for the rawhide cords he had stuffed in his pocket, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure beneath him bucked and writhed, but Jack was heavier, his position dominant. He yanked the arms behind the back, looping the cord around the wrists again and again, pulling it tight until the struggling ceased, replaced by a tense, quivering stillness. Only then, his heart still trying to beat its way out of his chest, did he roll the figure over. The hood had fallen back during the struggle. He found himself staring not into the grizzled, hardened face of a male outlaw, but into the fierce, dark eyes of a young woman. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The sounds of the stream, the wind, his own breathing, everything receded into a dull, roaring silence. Her face was sharp, intelligent, and etched with a fury so pure it was like a physical blow. Her black hair was long and braided, and across her forehead and high cheekbones were faded lines of paint, intricate patterns of yellow and white, now smudged from the struggle. She was Apache. There was no doubt about it. And she was not Coyote. A cold dread, far worse than any fear of an outlaw, washed over him. He had just assaulted and bound a woman from a tribe known for its ferocity and its long, bitter memory for wrongs. This was not a bounty. This was a death sentence, not just for him, but potentially for anyone on the outskirts of Sierra Nevada. The stories of Apache reprisals flashed through his mind, tales of fire and terror whispered around campfires. She said nothing. She just stared at him, her eyes holding his, and in their depths was no plea, no tears, only a promise of retribution. It was a gaze that stripped him bare, seeing the desperation, the foolishness, the profound error of his actions. He had thought he was hunting a predator, but he had snared Storm. For a long moment, he was frozen, kneeling over her, the unused length of rawhide dangling from his numb fingers. He could let her go, cut her bonds, apologize to the empty air, and run. But the fear was too great. If he released her, she would return to her people, and they would come for him. His mind, fogged with panic, could only conjure one solution. He could not undo what he had done, so he had to see it through. He had to take her with him. It made no logical sense, but terror has a logic of its own. His movements were jerky, robotic. He avoided her eyes as he got to his feet. He retrieved her rifle, a well-cared-for Springfield, and unloaded it, stuffing the cartridges into his pocket. He pulled her to her feet. She was light, but she held herself with a rigid dignity that made her seem taller. She refused to walk at first, standing rooted to the spot, a statue of defiance. He pulled on her bound arms, a clumsy, shameful gesture. I can't let you go," he mumbled, the words sounding feeble and stupid even to his own ears. She finally moved, but it was not a surrender. It was a calculated decision to conserve energy. She began to walk, her steps steady and deliberate, leading him back toward where Pike was tethered. It was an unnerving reversal. For a moment, it felt as though she was the one guiding him. Getting her onto Pike was another ordeal. He had to lift her, and she was as unyielding as a sack of grain. She sat side saddle in front of him, her back straight, her bound hands resting in her lap. He could feel the tension radiating from her, a live wire of contained fury. The ride back to his ranch was an eternity of silence and shame. The sun, which had once represented hope, now felt like a judgmental eye. Every shadow in the rocks seemed to hold watching eyes. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered curse. He took a circuitous route, avoiding the main trails, his paranoia painting an Apache warrior behind every mesa. When the familiar, dilapidated structures of his ranch finally came into view, the sagging barn, the small, weathered cabin, it was not with a sense of homecoming, but with the grim relief of a jailer arriving at his prison. He led Pike into the relative gloom of the barn. The smell of dry hay, old leather, and horse was usually a comfort. Now it smelled like confinement. He half lifted, half pulled the woman from the saddle. She stumbled slightly, but caught herself, her balance impeccable even with her wrists tied. He opened the door to the small, windowless storage shed at the back of the barn, a place where he kept tools and feed. It was dusty and dark, the only light seeping through the cracks in the warped wooden walls. He gestured for her to go inside. She paused at the threshold, turning her head to look at him one last time. Her gaze swept over him, from his dusty boots to his frightened face, and in it was a look of such profound, icy contempt that he felt shriveled by it. Then she stepped inside, and the darkness swallowed her. He closed the door, sliding the heavy wooden bolt across it. The solid thunk of the lock, engaging, was the loudest, most final sound he had ever heard. He stood there for a long time, his forehead pressed against the rough, splintered wood of the door, listening to the absolute silence from within. The weight of what he had done settled on him, heavier than any saddle, colder than any desert night. He had gone out to capture a monster and had instead stolen a piece of the sky itself, and he had no idea what to do with it. The $500 fell 1,000,000 miles away, and the problem in the shed was immediate, terrifying, and utterly, completely his. The silence from the shed was a physical presence, thick and accusatory. Jack spent the first hour pacing the dusty yard, his mind a frantic, trapped bird beating against the cage of his own foolishness. The initial surge of adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a cold, sickening dread that coiled in his stomach. He had to feed her, water her. It was a basic human thought that somehow made the situation even more monstrous. He fumbled in his cabin, finding a tin plate and a chipped cup. His hands shook as he scooped cold beans from a pot on the stove and filled the cup with water from the bucket. Approaching the shed felt like walking to the gallows. He slid the bolt back, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet evening, and pushed the door open just enough to slide the plate and cup inside. He caught a glimpse of her, sitting cross-legged in the center of the dirt floor, her back perfectly straight, her bound hands resting in her lap. She did not look at him or the food. She was looking at a narrow crack in the wall, where a sliver of dying sunlight painted a golden line on the ground. He closed the door quickly, locking her back into the darkness. The plate and cup remained untouched all night. The next morning, they were still there, the water undisturbed, the beans congealed. A knot of frustration tightened in Jack's chest. Her refusal was a silent power she wielded against him, and he was helpless against it. Word traveled fast in a small town like Sierra Nevada. By midday, a few of the local cowboys, curious and smelling drama, had ridden out to his place. They peered into the barn, joking crudely about his squaw and his strange method of saving the ranch. Their laughter was brittle and nervous. They told him to be careful, that Apache spirits could curse a man and his land. Others, older men with memories of sharper conflicts, advised him in low, serious tones to take her far out into the desert and let her go, to hope the distance, and her life would be enough to settle the debt. But the fear of a war party finding his trail, of her leading them straight back, kept him paralyzed. He was stuck, the keeper of a dangerous, silent prisoner who was slowly, day by day, dismantling his resolve with nothing but her stillness and her unbroken gaze. He began to notice things about her in the fleeting moments he opened the door. She was not wasting away. Her eyes were clear, her composure absolute. She was observing everything: the layout of the barn, the position of the tools, the pattern of his movements, the sounds of the town carried on the wind. She was learning her prison, and in doing so, she was turning the tables, making him feel like the one who was trapped. The change began on a night scented with sage and cooled by a high desert wind. Jack was cleaning his rifle by the light of a single oil lamp on his porch, the day's tension a permanent ache in his shoulders, when the dog started barking frickly down by the old creek trail. He stood up, peering into the darkness, his hand instinctively tightening on the Winchester. He saw the shadows first, 4 of them, moving with a purposeful stealth that was not friendly. They were men from town, hired muscle sent by the bank's agent, a man named Fletcher, who had decided that waiting for foreclosure was an inconvenience. Their intent was clear: to persuade Jack through brute force to vacate the property immediately. They fanned out as they approached the cabin, their forms coalescing from the gloom. One of them, a hulking figure with a thick club, smashed the lamp, plunging the porch into darkness. Jack brought the rifle up, but a second man came at him from the side, tackling him hard against the cabin wall. The air exploded from his lungs, and the rifle clattered to the wooden planks. A fist connected with his jaw, and bright lights flashed behind his eyes. He tasted blood. He fought back wildly, but he was outnumbered and overpowered. A kick to his ribs stole his breath again, and he crumpled to his knees, gasping. Through a haze of pain, he saw one of the men pouring kerosene from a can onto the porch walls. This was beyond persuasion. This was eradication. A cold certainty of his own end washed over him. And then, from the direction of the barn, a voice cut through the grunts and the scuffling. It was calm, low, and unervingly clear. It was her voice. She spoke a single sharp sentence in her own language, then repeated the meaning in slow, measured English. She told him to get to the water trough and stay low. In that moment, shattered and defeated, Jack had no other options. He acted on pure instinct, scrambling on all fours through the legs of his surprised assailants, half falling, half crawling to the large, filled water trough near the corral and pressing himself against its cool, wet side. What happened next unfolded with a speed and precision that he could later only recall in fragments. The barn door slid open without a sound. A shadow, darker than the night, detached itself and flowed into the yard. He saw one of the men suddenly cry out and collapse, clutching his leg where a sharpened hoof pick was embedded deep in the thigh. Another turned towards the movement and was momentarily blinded by a handful of dust and grit thrown perfectly into his eyes. The man with the kerosene can found the can itself knocked from his hand, and a moment later, he was stumbling backwards, tripping over a strategically placed wagon tongue he hadn't seen, landing hard on his back. There was no grand battle, no exchange of gunfire. It was a dissection. She used the darkness, the terrain, and simple, brutal efficiency. She moved like water, like smoke, always just out of reach, her strikes surgical and debilitating. Within minutes, the four men were neutralized, one unconscious, the others disarmed, injured, and stumbling in panic back into the darkness from which they had come. The yard fell silent again, save for the moaning of the wounded man and Jack's own ragged breathing. He looked up to see her standing over him, the rawhide cords that had bound her hanging loose from one wrist, the other end cleanly severed. She had not run. She had saved him. She looked down at him, her expression unreadable in the starlight, then gestured with her chin towards his cabin. She needed something. Still in shock, Jack pushed himself to his feet, wincing at the pain in his ribs. He followed her into the cabin, where she pointed to a pouch of sewing needles and some clean cloth. He watched, mesmerized, as she efficiently built a small fire in the hearth, selected a needle, and held it in the flames. Then she turned to him, pointed to his bloody lip and his side, and gestured for him to sit. He obeyed. She cleaned his wounds with water and a bitter-smelling paste she made from a dried root she had apparently been concealing on her person. She then threaded the needle and, with hands that were utterly steady, stitched the gash on his lip. It was not a gentle act, but it was swift and expert. In that quiet, fire-lit cabin, the relationship had been irrevocably shattered and remade. He was no longer her jailer. She was no longer his prisoner. They were something else entirely, bound by a debt and a shared, violent secret. The following days were a strange, silent apprenticeship. The woman Nisa moved with a new, unspoken authority around the ranch. She no longer retreated to the shed, instead occupying a corner of the porch or the barn, always watching, always assessing. Jack, for his part, did not try to restrain her again. The attempt would have been futile and, after what had happened, profoundly foolish. His focus shifted. The bounty on Coyote was forgotten, replaced by a more immediate need, to find the men who had sent the attackers and to ensure it would not happen again. He knew it was Fletcher, the bank agent, but he needed proof, and he needed a way to stop him for good. He began to prepare to ride into town to confront him, gathering what few papers he had, cleaning his pistol, with a grim determination. Nisa watched him for a long time from the porch. Then she stood up, walked to where Pike was tethered, and simply looked at Jack, then at the saddle. The message was clear. She was coming with him. He did not argue. They rode out together, not as captor and captive, not even as companions, but as a single unit with a shared purpose. Jack thought he knew the land, but Nisa showed him that he was blind. She would stop Pike with a touch, pointing to a barely visible scuff on a rock, the faint impression of a shod horse in a patch of soft earth that Jack would have ridden right past. She was not following the trail to town. She was following a different one that spoke of another rider moving with purpose through the canyons. She was looking for her brother, a warrior named Talon, who would be searching for her. As they tracked, she began to teach him without words. She showed him how to move, so his boots made no sound on the gravel, how to use the contours of the land for cover instead of just riding over it. She demonstrated how to listen, not just for obvious sounds, but for the absence of them, for the way a sudden silence from the birds could be a more eloquent warning than any shout. They came across the remains of a campfire, and from the way the ashes were scattered and the position of a single discarded cartridge, she deduced that 3 men had been there, one of them left-handed, and they had left in a hurry, heading not towards town, but deeper into the Badlands. It was the trail of Coyote's gang. Jack realized with a cold jolt that had he been alone, he would have ridden straight into an ambush they had set on the main trail. Nisa had not only found a different path, she had led him around a trap. She was not just a guide, she was a strategist. She was hunting her own kin while simultaneously protecting him from his own prey. In her silent, efficient way, she was revealing a world layered on top of his own, a world of signs and meanings he had never learned to read. Their return to Sierra Nevada coincided with the storm breaking. They crested the rise overlooking the town to see not the usual quiet cluster of buildings, but a scene of chaos. Black smoke pillared into the sky from the livery stable. The sharp, flat reports of gunfire echoed between the false-fronted buildings. Coyote's gang, perhaps believing the town had betrayed them to the law, or simply seizing an opportunity for plunder, had decided to burn it to the ground. The townspeople were in a panicked rout. Men fired from windows haphazardly. Women and children screamed as they fled toward the church, and the gang, hardened and ruthless, moved through the streets with methodical violence. The sheriff was down, wounded and pinned behind a water barrel. Jack felt a surge of helpless anger. This was a fight they could not win. He looked at Nisa, expecting to see confirmation to flee, but her expression was different. It was not anger nor fear. It was a cold, calculating focus. She slid from Pike's back and, without a backward glance, started down the slope, not towards the thick of the fighting, but along its periphery, using the burning buildings for cover. Jack, compelled by her certainty, followed. What happened next was not a heroic charge, it was a tactical unraveling. Nisa did not engage the gang directly. She moved like a ghost through the smoke and chaos. She found a group of terrified women hiding in the alley behind the saloon and, with sharp gestures, directed them onto the rooftops, miming for them to throw tiles and shout, to create the illusion of a large force. She found a young boy cowering near the general store and pressed a small mirror into his hand, positioning him in an upstairs window to signal the positions of the outlaws to Jack, who she had stationed with his rifle in the bell tower of the church. She herself targeted the gang's logistics. A single, well-aimed shot from her, recovered Springfield, shattered the whiskey bottle one outlaw was using to make a Molotov cocktail, the spreading alcohol dousing the man's legs in flame. She cut the reins of their horses, sending the spooked animals stampeding through the main street, disrupting their movements. She used the town itself as her weapon, turning its alleys into killing zones and its rooftops into strongholds. She directed the few able-bodied men who were not frozen with fear, showing them where to aim, when to shoot, and more importantly, when to fall back to a better position. She was a force of nature, a whirlwind of strategy and resolve. The tide of the battle turned not with a single act of bravery, but with the relentless application of a superior mind. The gang, expecting a disorganized defense, found themselves outmaneuvered and confused at every turn. When Jack, following the boy's mirror signals, shot the rifle from Coyote's hand, it was the final decisive blow. The remaining outlaws, leaderless and spooked by the unseen, omnipresent foe, broke and fled. The town of Sierra Nevada, battered and smoking, but intact, fell into a stunned, disbelieving silence. In the aftermath, as the smoke began to slowly drift away on the wind, the people of Sierra Nevada emerged from their hiding places. They gathered in the main street, their faces smudged with soot and etched with shock, looking at the bodies of the fallen outlaws and the wreckage of their homes. Then, as one, their gaze turned to the slender, straight-backed Apache woman standing near the covered water trough, calmly cleaning the barrel of her Springfield. The silence was profound, broken only by the crackle of dying fires. This was the creature they had feared, the savage they had warned Jack about, and she had just orchestrated their salvation. The crowd parted as a new figure emerged from the canyon trail, a powerful Apache warrior on a painted horse, his face set in grim lines. It was Talon, Niza's brother. He had followed the signs of the large battle, his expression dark with the expectation of finding his sister slain. Instead, he found her standing amidst the grateful, awestruck townspeople. He dismounted and walked towards her. He did not speak. He looked at her, then at the scene around them, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Niza met his gaze and gave a single, slight nod. Talon's stern expression did not change, but he reached into a pouch at his belt and withdrew a long necklace of polished claws and eagle feathers, the mark of a respected warrior and a wise leader. In front of the entire assembled town, he placed it around his sister's neck. The gesture was more eloquent than any speech. It spoke of honor, of courage, of a battle rightly fought. Niza turned to face the people. Her eyes swept over them, not with triumph, but with a quiet, formidable dignity. She made a small, inclusive gesture with her hand, indicating the townsfolk who had fought, the boy in the window, the women on the roofs. The honor was shared. Jack watched from the steps of the church, the bounty money for Coyote, now secured, feeling like a trivial, meaningless weight in his pocket. He walked over to Niza and held the entire pouch out to her. She looked at him, then at the money, and after a moment, she accepted it with a slow, deliberate nod. It was not payment, it was a tribute, a recognition of a debt that could never be fully repaid. She turned and walked towards her brother's horse. She did not look back. There were no farewells. She mounted up behind Talon, and the two of them rode out of Sierra Nevada, not as fugitives or specters, but as legends. The townspeople watched them go until they were specks on the horizon, the story of the Apache woman who saved them already solidifying into the bedrock of the town's history, a tale that would be told for generations, changing forever the way they saw the land and the people who had always called it home.